Join our Patreon.
Do you really want to know? We are Mythvision.
Dr. Price, I want to go ahead and drop a plug. You have a book coming out, Judaizing Jesus. I don't know what you're going to subtitle it, but Judaizing Jesus. And when we think Jesus, we think Jew. We think in the context, in the situation of Israel, there's so much Jewish stuff, quoting Old Testament or Hebrew Bible, that makes you just go, this is a Jew. This is a Jew's Jew, okay? And we've talked in previous episodes about how the most primitive possible movement that we could think of, and we can use reasons to suggest that there was an earlier Jewish-only movement. Hint, Acts chapter 10 comes on the scene. Like, what the heck? Where'd this come from? You mean others are allowed into this thing? This is not something we saw coming. Matthew seems to be, he came for the lost sheep of the house of Israel only, and Matthew's very Jewish anyway in the way he writes, even though there's replacement theology ideas in it, hint. Anyway, where's my question going? My question's going here. It seems very Jewish. The whole New Testament has a lot of that. But it also has some strange stuff popping in. Eat of my flesh, drink of my blood. Foreign, strange, non-Jewish ideas are finding their way in. Is this later interpolated ideas that the pagan Gentile church is incorporating onto a primitive or a proto, the earliest Jewish movement? Did the earliest Jewish mystery cult possibly, or if it was a mystery cult, did they have this Eucharist, or was this possibly just a fringe sect of Judaism, got wrapped up in a mystery school type cult of Gnostic teachings, and they got married, so to speak? What are you finding in the developing, your research, number one, and your development of this book that you have coming out, Judaizing Jesus? I'm sure it touches something here, but what are your thoughts on that?
Well, for a long time, I've noticed how it's a trend among New Testament scholars, I almost want to call it a fad, to say that, square one is that Jesus was a Torah-observant Jew, much like the Pharisees, possibly even actually a Pharisee of different opinions. They had different views on different things. And like the house of Hillel and the house of Shammai, they were constantly debating. But that Jesus must be understood this way. And I think a whole lot of them say Jesus is really some kind of a rabbi. Well, it seems to me that this is a little too convenient in that it's always broached in the context of Jewish-Christian dialogue, ecumenical dialogue. That naturally, given the horrendous history of mistreatment of Jews by Christians, that there's a lot of guilt, but more importantly, a lot of urgency to heal that rift and to get along. And that is symbolized in a way by the notion of a Jesus acceptable to Judaism. And they know this would not be the incarnate Son of God who died for sins. And hence, let's just leave that out of it, basically, and come up with a way that Jesus could be understood as a prophet and a rabbi, and we can all get together around that. And there's nothing drastically wrong with that, but it seems a little oversimple to me and to produce a lot of spin and often and that there are other things that motivate it. There is a desperation on the part of more and more scholars to go along with the evangelicals and fundamentalists who want Christianity simply to be an extension of the Old Testament. If somebody says, well, I think there's a significant mystery religion inheritance there. There's some real Gnostic or other DNA in it. No, No, they don't want that because they want it to be a pure revelation, the latest stage, like in the beginning of Hebrews. In the past, God revealed things to our fathers in dribs and drabs, but we got the full thing this time with Jesus. And so they don't want it to appear to be a syncretistic religious movement. And it's another part of a larger thing to deny that there were pre-Christian dying and rising gods and so forth. And that strikes me as axe grinding. I have to suspect that they're Judaizing Jesus, that it's not so clear that there was a rabbi Jesus from Galilee. But then the question comes up, well, what's the alternative? And you can argue, as Nazi theologians once did, that Jesus was some sort of a sage, etc., but he wasn't a Jew. And this part of it is not absurd, but it's so dubious. The idea that, well, they called Galilee of the Gentiles because there must have been ethnically mixed people there. And you can even go back some centuries to stories from Herodotus and Josephus and so on about foreigners coming and intermixing, or people conquering it and leaving people there and so forth. So it's conceivable that it's almost like this Israel-only thing. What counts as a Jew? Maybe in a genetic sense he wasn't, and of course this is propounded by fanatics and lunatics that say that they don't want Jesus to be Jewish because they don't like Jews. As the guy says in the Raiders of the Lost Ark, I am uncomfortable with this Jewish ritual. That's no acceptable motivation. But and there isn't really any good reason to think there was a historical Jesus and he was some kind of Gentile. It's possible, but there's no real reason to think so. So that I discuss, but reject. But there are other possibilities, for instance, that Jesus was basically a cynic philosopher, and that's a widely held view in New Testament scholarship, that he was like Diogenes and various other ones who were like Meleager of Gadara, or one of the Decapolis cities. He's a famous cynic. And who are these guys? Well, they were sort of grandchildren of Socrates and believed that our task as humans was to live in accordance with nature by reason. And so they rejected all social systems and social niceties and just walked around wearing a tunic or a barrel or whatever, or stark naked, and they'd urinate in public as if they lived in San Francisco, and they had no money. If they had it, they gave it away. They renounced marriage and it just said, we're like the birds of the air. God feeds them, he'll take care of us. And there are many sayings from the cynics that sound astonishingly like gospel sayings. And in fact, I don't think you can find any parallel in any kind of known Judaism to the radicalism of the sayings that sound cynic, capital C, in the Gospels. And so it seems to me it may well be that Burton Mack and others are right, that was the historical Jesus, if there was one, but that he got Judaized. In this case, the historical Jesus wouldn't have cared a fig for orthodoxy and religious observance, and might even have spoken satirically of it, like in Mark 7. It's not what goes into a man that makes him unclean, it's what comes out of him. And as we now read the continuation, that's evil words and thoughts. But he also says in the same passage, everything passes through the body and goes out into the latrine, thus being purified. Is he really saying that about how kosher food it's pointless, it doesn't matter because it's just going down the toilet anyway? That's the kind of small c cynical remark these guys would make. They lampooned conventional religion and so on. They had no respect for anything. Jesus could have been like that. And yet he is remembered in a domesticated way. He's assimilated to the rabbis and the Pharisees because many of them somehow got attracted to this movement. It would be exactly like in the Upanishads, the Hindu clergy, the priesthood, they were in charge of the sacrifices, and the whole Vedic religion was about that, sacrifices to the different gods for different ends and so on. But there grew up among the Kshatriya caste, the warrior caste, right below them on the totem pole, a movement of mysticism that rendered sacrifices irrelevant, and so they stopped going to the altars and sacrificing the animals and stuff, and instead retreated to the forest to meditate. And they believed that the dawning enlightenment in them was the real sacrifice, like Paul says, the spiritual worship, and so on. And yet, eventually, you find things like the Upanishads that set forth the monistic philosophy of these yogis and ascetics and hermits using the Vedic scriptures. And what's plainly happened here was that the priesthood began to like what they heard, and yet they didn't want to give up the institutional religion they were in, so they reinterpreted it as a kind of, like in Colossians, a shadow play pointing to the reality inside. And so it seems to me that you can show precedence for this and say that, many Jews who liked what they heard but didn't want to just break with their tradition needed a Jesus who was more like them and created it. Another possibility, and this one is the one I really favor, is that you need to explain how on earth Pauline Hellenistic Christianity could ever have been under the same roof as Jewish Torah Christianity with the Rabbi Jesus. How could these things have come together? Well, we read in Galatians of Paul going to Jerusalem to see the three pillars, James, John, and Cephas, to get their approval for his ministry. And they did give it, but he had to pay for it. They put a tax on him that he had to collect money from the Gentile churches, of which there were many, to pay as tribute to the head office in Jerusalem. And this gave legitimacy to both, and it's like a big corporation buying out a small one. And so that Paul, I think, had a celestial Christ who would never come to earth. And there were some Jews who had similar ideas, like Philo, who believed in a heavenly logos and all of that, and even called it the Son of Man and so forth. That Paul was probably part of that, and also perhaps in Qumran with the Dead Sea Scrolls people, but broke with them. Then what about the Jewish group? Led by the Pillars? Well, I suspect they were the Qumran group, or one just like it. As Eisenman says, there were loads of these different sectarian groups. One thing we know about the Dead Sea Scrolls people was they were led by a council of 12, who obviously represented patriarchs of a new Israel, and within that there was a circle of 3. Well, what do you see in the New Testament? There are 12 disciples / apostles, about most of whom we never hear anything. There's really nothing about them said. But there are 3 biggies, the 3 pillars. And I think that both of the images of these groups, the new 12, in the regeneration of all things, you 12 will sit on thrones governing the tribes of Israel, well, religiously, and that the core was the pillars. And if you look at what their names mean, or their epithets, Simon Cephas, Peter, is the rock, and as other scholars have said, this seems to be a reference to the navel stone in the temple, which they believed stopped up the waters below the earth and prevented a second flood from happening. So Peter is the foundation stone of something. And James and John are called Boanerges, which seems to be a version of the sons of the Thunderer, or the sons of Zeus, and that they were the two pillars, Jachin and Boaz, in the temple. And so these guys had cosmic significance in their own right. Okay, so the others didn't necessarily. And so what has happened is that in the fusion of the two groups, you have those who were the original leaders, the pillars and the 12, shunted aside a bit in favor of Paul's Jesus, who was drawn in. There was no role for him in the original. And Martin notes redundancy principle in his history of Pentateuchal tradition. He says there are a number of stories about Moses and Aaron where one of them is, or both, are not even originally in the story. Like, who was it who went into Pharaoh? It was the elders of Israel. But it was just about them, but now Moses and Aaron are inserted, and they really have no role in it. Who went up to the mountain to have a dinner with God? It says, well, it was Moses, Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu. Who? Some priestlings. What are they even doing there? Well, originally they were the stars of the story. They must have been, but when Moses and Aaron came to prominence, these guys weren't kicked off the stage because the story was well known. They were in it, but now they're sort of extras, and Moses and Aaron have replaced them. Well, in the same way, James, Cephas, and John are now represented as 3 of the 12, and they're the same ones we know as James, Peter, and John in the Gospels, even though later they're made into separate people. A couple of them are anyway. That's who they were, the center of it to begin with, but now they're kind of shoved into Jesus' shadow. Where does all the Jewish stuff come in? Well, in order to historicize Jesus, which people kind of wanted to do to have the copyright on the true doctrine, oh yeah, we got it from the horse's mouth, they had to create a historical human life for Paul's Jesus. And where did they get it? Well, from the Old Testament. All the stuff that the prophets had done and that the Messiah was supposed to do, they just reworded the stories, and that's who Jesus is in the Gospels. I mean, why else would virtually every story in the Gospels mirror Old Testament stories? Why is it that virtually every saying of Jesus is verbatim the same as something you can find in the Mishnah and so on? And in the Gospel of John, it all sounds Gnostic. It sounds like they got it from the Mandean writings and so on. Well, they did. What they did was to create the Jewish Jesus in the image that was relevant to them. They weren't concerned about some celestial Jesus. They wanted a rabbi Jesus. And so at the very beginning, they did what I'm saying Christian and Jewish scholars are doing now, taking the gospel Jesus and making him as Jewish as possible, and for a similar reason, ecumenical combination. So I got a lot more to think about, but that's the direction I want to go with how the modern rabbi Jesus is an artificial creation as a tool for ecumenical dialogue, but that something similar happened 2,000 years ago that would explain how on earth Pauline, Marcionite, Gnostic Christianity became federated with a Qumran-like Jewish group, and why. So that's my broad outline of what I'm going to try to show in this book.
I was going to end that question that I asked with and follow up by answering it in one sentence. So That was 18 minutes of a sentence. I appreciate. No, I'm just kidding. You can never ask Bob in one sentence.
That's right.
You might as well say, "I'm not even. Don't even ask." No, that was actually really well put. It makes me think of a lot of different things now, different things to consider there. So, really appreciate that, Bob. Join our Patreon